My name's Bob Doyle. I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I lived in public housing until I was about 12 years old. I attended public schools. I was in something called the health class from grades 1 to 7. I was the only one in my class, so I was first for 7 years. Then I had to learn to compete. In the 8th grade, my teachers told my mother that I was not college material, and
That's discouraging.
and so it was. Well, at the time it wasn't. I wasn't sure what I would be when I grew up. But then in high school, at least for the first 2 years, I was in the commercial course and bored out of my skull.
Oh,
And at that point, I said to my mother I wanted to quit school. And that didn't make her too happy, but she didn't say no, which was a surprise. Then I got ill one day at school, and the school nurse told me about something called the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Act. And if I could pass some sort of a test, I would be able to get books and tuition to college. And so I took the test, and obviously I passed it. And I went to Boston University at Earl Borgeson's urging. He wanted me to continue my education.
now Earl was at Harvard at the time? as
Earl was
the
at
head
Harvard.
librarian? Yeah.
And I started at Harvard when I was a little over 16 years old. I wanted a job, and my father sent me to see a friend of his who worked at the Harvard Law School named Jim Coward. And Jim was the night supervisor. That's an interest. Jim spent 50 years working for Harvard, along with people like Phil Putnam and so forth. So there were a whole bunch of people who had worked 50 years in the library. But Earl hired me, and I'm not sure he was sure about hiring me, which is another funny story.
Maybe he didn't hire kids or something, or,
Well, they sent me to see the university doctor,
oh,
and I had to have a physical,
see if
and-
you were up to the
whether I was up to it or not.
aspects of it, yeah.
Well, at that time, I walked more than a mile to high school every day, except when it rained. And so there was no problem. But looking back on it, it was probably an out if there was one for them. So it was an interesting experience, because later I learned that other people who were hired part-time didn't have to take a physical. But
Well, this was before the Americans with Disabilities Act and all
Lots
the
of other
new
things.
rules and
Yeah.
so on, yeah.
so it was a whole different.
Well, it sounds like it worked out for you, though, Bob.
It really did.
So Earl was your first boss, sort of.
Earl was my first boss,
And,
and
he suggested that you should,
he was
consider
encouraging
college.
me to go on, and so I spent 2 years in high school trying to get all the credits you gathered over 4 years, which made it a trial and a half, but I made it, much to my surprise. But I enjoyed my work at Harvard, and when I got accepted to college, Earl, they'd finished building the International Legal Studies building, and Val Mustecki was going to be the director. And so they said they'd put me on as the night supervisor while I went to school days. So I worked at the law school at night, and I went to school during the day. And so I got up in the morning and took the train over to Boston University, and then I came back and I stopped in Harvard Square and I stopped in a Greasy Spoon and I had a hot dog and some French fries and a Coke, and that was what sent me off to work. And then when I got finished, I went home and my mother had a dinner waiting for me. So that was the sort of the.
So you got your baccalaureate degree from?
I got my baccalaureate from Boston University in political science.
Mm-hmm.
And
I know you have 2 more degrees. You want to tell us a little bit about those too?
well, I was working at Harvard, and I ran for office. I ran for state representative in the Harvard Square District area. I ran for office and lost. And then people were urging me to run for county commissioner because I lived in Cambridge, and it was the largest city in the Middlesex County.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have to run against someone named Jack Dever, who was the nephew of a former Massachusetts governor. But he lived in a small town. So he called me up one day and offered me a job at the Middlesex County Law Library as the librarian. And so I thought it was a good idea, and I took the job. And the woman who was the librarian, Pearl Larson, was a Republican, and she was 70 years old. And she stayed in the library for about 2 months while I was in charge of the library. And she realized I knew what I was doing, and I wasn't a drunk, and that I would not make a mess out of her library. So she gracefully retired at that point.
So she had discovered a successor that she could trust to do the job right.
Well, she felt confident about it. So the day I gave my notice at Harvard, I went to a dance at a boat club on the Charles River, and I met my wife, Nancy, and we got married 6 months later. And then I kept talking about going to law school because Earl Borgeson had said to me, no one's going to care whether you have a library degree or not, but you should have a law degree. So I went to the Portia Law School, which is now the New England School of Law. And I was in my 4th year evenings, and Val Mustecki called me from California, and Val said, Bob, I want you to come out and be in charge of public services
So
and
this
reference.
was after Val had moved out and was now the law library
Val had
director
moved
at Bull
to-
Hall in Berkeley.
Val had moved to Buffalo
Yeah.
and then had gone out to Berkeley.
Yeah, so this is, he's out at the University of California at Berkeley
So
as
he
director
called-
at that point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so he called me up and he said, I want you to be in charge of public services and reference. And I said, no. And he said, why not? And I said, Val, I've worked for you for a number of years now, and I get out there and I'll never finish my law degree. And so he said, well, I'll have to hire someone else. And then in January, Val called me up one night and he said, when could you start? And I said, July 1st. And he said, okay, you're hired. So I never saw Bolt Hall or been to Berkeley at that point until the day I flew out after the Massachusetts bar, and my wife and son with us. And so we went out, signed up, and we were out at Berkeley for approximately 6.5 years. And I worked there with Tom Reynolds and Muriel Hoppus. I don't know if you remember Muriel or
Yes.
not. And Cosette's son was one of my reference assistants before she went to Alameda County.
Reynolds and Cossette's son are both have done videos for our oral history.
Really?
Yeah, they're still around, and pleased to be able to get them both on camera.
Yes, well, Tom and Cosette were great people to work with, and I enjoyed working with them. And I finished my library degree out at Berkeley. And
So you got the law degree in Boston.
Boston,
And at
And I-
the Portia.
at
the school.
Portia, which
Yeah.
became New England School of Law.
Then did you start your library degree before you moved, or you were moving, so I suppose you
I didn't.
just waited?
I went out to Berkeley, and then I started my library degree at Berkeley.
Okay.
And Mike Jacobstein was my instructor in legal research. And
Talk
then-
about a mentor of the first order.
Yes, and of course, at that point, Earl Borgeson was at the library at Stanford.
That's
And-
right. He had left Harvard and was the associate university librarian, I
Librarian.
think, at the main library at Stanford
Yes.
University.
And so we had a lot of trips over to Stanford to see Mike and Earl. So it was like old home week out in California.
I mean, if you're not going to stay in Boston, move out where all your old friends and bosses are.
Yeah. So when I finished my library degree, I started job hunting. And Mike Jacobstein called me and said, Bob, I want you to look at this job at Loyola in Chicago. I really didn't want to come to Chicago, but I didn't want to say no to Mike because I thought it might be the last time he called me up.
I can understand that. You might think that you're one of those people that just was going to stay right there in
Yeah,
Berkeley, California.
yeah. Everybody. I had a neighbor who I knew back east, and he worked for Oscar Mayer, and he was the leading salesman in Northern California. And his boss was saying to him, "Why don't you take jobs? You are a leading salesman." He said, "I'm waiting for you to retire." And so I think a lot of people thought that was what happened.
Yeah.
And of course, so I said, okay, I'll go look at the job at Loyola in Chicago. The next day, Morris Cohen called me and offered me a job to go back to Harvard. And I said I didn't want to go back. I said I've been there, done that. I
Yeah.
didn't think it would add to my career possibilities. And so Morris said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, Mike wants me to look at this job at Loyola in Chicago. And Morris said, I know the associate dean. Would you like me to call her? And I said, well, it can't hurt. So about a week later, Dean Murdoch called me and he said, we've been looking for a law librarian for 6 months. And then within 24 hours, your name is recommended to us by the law librarian at Stanford and the law librarian at Harvard. Where the hell have you been? And jokingly, I said, I've been waiting for you to call me. And so I went out for the interview, and while I was there, the Board of Trustees decided they would build a new law library, a law school. And I called my wife and I said, I think they're going to make me an offer. And Nancy said, but you told me we would live by the ocean. And I said, Nance, when you can't see the other side of the water, it's just like the ocean. And she said, well, okay. So,
So you had like Michigan to fall back on.
yeah. So we moved here, and I spent 25 years at the Loyola Library. And Dean Murdoch moved on, and the new dean, Gina Pell, was a great person to work for.
Well, it sounds like you had an interesting introduction to the profession. I mean, the opportunity to work in some of the libraries you were in and with some of the really major leaders at the time in our profession.
It really was.
Yeah.
And you know, I started as a page at the Harvard Law School, and I was a junior in high school.
Yeah.
And Earl kept urging me on, and I worked under Val Mustecchi for a long time at International Legal Studies. I spent a year working in the other part of the law library under George Strait, and I worked with Phil Putnam. Phil was the world's greatest reference librarian in my judgment,
Yeah.
and I even worked with some degree with the Moody sisters,
Oh, yes,
And-
and technical services, cataloging and
cataloging
acquisitions, I
and
think.
acquisitions. And so I got a real education working at the Harvard Law School. One of the first jobs I had the summer between my junior and senior year in high school, I filed all of the CCH services for all 50 states for a whole year. If you want to talk about getting crazy, if that didn't kill your
I
enthusiasm, nothing
assume
did.
someone was supposed to have been doing that and hadn't been doing it.
Hadn't been doing it.
Yeah, so
And
you
they said, Doyle,
cleaned up the problems.
clean up this problem. So I've forgotten how much time sitting in a room with all the state tax services, filing services, and of course the numbers were all the same. It was just absolutely maddening. But it was a discipline that I learned. Working for Jim Coward, I don't know if you realize it, but when I went to work at Harvard Law School, there was no classification system.
Well, there really wasn't even later, because they put together a system
Right.
that kind of put the books in a general vicinity of each other.
Yes.
You had to really hunt. Well, you know that. You were working finding them down there for people for a while.
Yeah, and so it was quite a task, and you really had to learn to read a catalog at that point, so you knew what size the book was and almost what color it was and what it said on the spine.
The more
so
you
forth.
knew about it, the better you're off.
Everything,
in finding
everything
it, I
you
guess.
needed to know was in the catalog at the time.
Yeah.
And so I learned to use the catalog to a great extent, just to be a good searcher of materials. So that was one of the great things. And then when I worked for Valen, I learned about putting UN document in all of their various forms together. And then they had all of the international military tribunal materials. We had to learn how to put those back together when someone wanted them. And you had interesting things happening, like we would have old Russians coming to look at the official gazettes of the Tsar to show that they were in the White Army at the time of the Revolution, so they could get a pension in Canada.
Oh,
I mean, things
Well.
like this that
interesting reference questions, huh?
you just wouldn't expect to have to do. So it was a wonderful experience. And then, of course, they had all of the records and briefs for the First Circuit Court and for the Supreme Court of the United States. And so keeping those together and organized was something that you learned to deal with very much. So it was a great experience moving these things. All of the foreign treatises, for example, were in one collection. And when we moved to the International Legal Collection, we had to figure out what country the book belonged to and put it in the right country. So initially, we went through and put all the books by wherever they were published. Of course, then we had to reshuffle a lot of books, but it got a huge collection into the countries where they belong. So it was an interesting
That must have been
experience.
an interesting project, because if you look at the place where they're printed or published, you're gonna get I suppose, a relatively handful of major cities, like London.
Yeah. So it was, that was a another one of those great experiences that I had from Harvard. I remember when I was taking the acquisitions course at Berkeley, my professor said, "What are you taking this course for? You know most of the material." I said, "I think it'll look good on my CV." And
They also been required by the school.
and it was required. Jim Hallow was one of my classmates
Oh, was he?
at Berkeley. So it was an interesting experience. Jim and I became close friends, and I can remember talking with him a lot about librarianship, and then all of the places he was when he was moving around and making his way through the law library profession.
Yeah.
So it was
Well, he's
a
still
fun-
in Williamsburg, Virginia.
and, and he met his wife, and they got married, and I think she was a librarian in San Francisco at the time, and so that we got to meet her. So we had some great relationships.
Well, it sounds like you also did some interesting things. You described some of what you did at Harvard. Tell us a little bit about some of what you did at the Suffolk Law Library, besides get a law degree.
Well, at Middlesex Library,
Or Middlesex, I'm sorry. I
the
misstated.
Middlesex Law Library was an interesting place. I used to joke with Edgar Belfontaine, because Edgar used to be very proud of the fact that his was the oldest law library, and then
Yeah.
we had to redefine that because he had the oldest private law library in the country.
Yeah, he was at the Social Law
At the
Library,
Social
which was a proprietary, where the members
Members-
basically
so-
kept it going.
So the Middlesex Law Library was the oldest public law library.
Uh-huh.
So we had a lot of fun going back and forth, and Edgar was a great person to know and to work with when we were in Boston. When I got the job at Middlesex, Earl Borgeson, I think, was a little nervous about my taking a job like that, and so he had George Strait take me out to Worcester County Law Library, where George had been the law librarian, and I spent a day with the law librarian there. She was teaching me about the budgeting kinds of things, because I'd never had any experience working with a budget and dealing with the Massachusetts legislature, which was another interesting
I
experience.
imagine it would be.
Well, as it turned out, my secretary at the county library, her brother was the state representative, and he became the chairman of the Committee on Counties. So when I had to go over to justify my budget, it's good to see you, Bob. And I had to then worry about whether or not somebody else would find something to cut in my budget.
Now,
So-
you got that job. You were telling us earlier that you were thinking of running for
County commissioner.
county commissioner, and one of your
One of the-
people in opposition to you as
Offered me
another
the job.
candidate, was he co-opting you, getting you
Well,
that
I think
job?
he wanted me out of the way politically.
Okay, did it work?
It worked.
Okay.
I mean, he was county commissioner. He continued to be county commissioner, and a couple of times had tried to run for lieutenant governor.
Okay.
He never really succeeded in that.
Maybe he
but-
didn't have any good jobs for the competition in that race.
Yeah, well, it was interesting because the county had to deal with the low bidder. The low bidder hadn't built anything but three-story apartment houses, and he had a job that was going to be like a 12-story high-rise building. And so what happened was that it was all filled land, and
Oh,
he just kept throwing pylons into nowhere and went broke. And so for most of the time I was waiting for the library to be built, it was a water hole behind the law library and courthouse. It finally got built, but that was after I left. So it was an interesting experience. But again, I learned a lot about planning a library from that experience, because I had to know where we were going to put things when we moved into the new building. One summer, I had more students working for me than I needed, and so I had them up in the attic with all the books that we had bought in anticipation of moving, and we're cleaning them up and numbering them and so forth. And one of the students put his foot through the floor of the attic, and the next thing was that the people in the probation department underneath had this foot coming at them from the ceiling. And it was one of those times when there were lots of rebels around, and I was sitting in my office, and I look out the window, and there's an awful lot of activity. And finally I opened the window and I said, "What's going on?" And somebody said, "There's a bomb in the building." And so I got everybody in the library out of the building, but I had to call the county commissioner and say, I know we're on the bottom of the totem pole, but I don't want to be the one who goes up in the air if there really is a bomb. So that was one of those interesting experiences.
well, you eventually go from one coast to the other coast, and then you come back in what some of us term the middle of the country, although it's probably geographically a bit east of that, and that's here in Chicago area.
Yes.
And you start off, and again, the dean has hired you, you found out that they're gonna build a new law school and law library, presumably.
Well,
So-
it was interesting because the dean said it's going to be a 5-story building, and the law library will be on 2 floors. And it sounded wonderful. And then, of course, as you get into it and start your planning, I went to see the dean and I said, the law library, it's not big enough, because at that point we were planning libraries the last 20 years.
Yes, and it was all books you were buying
And
too,
it was all
not
books.
digital stuff.
And I said, we won't last 20 years. I said, my best guess is that we'd only last 12 years. And the dean's response was, I don't care, I'm getting a new law school. And so I said, yeah, but I might be here. And he said, well, that'll be your problem then. And so the dean, he went on to be the first assistant to the state attorney general, and then came back as a faculty member. But the new dean was in place, and one day the dean, she called me up and she said, Bob, do you realize where we stand in relationship to other law school libraries? And I said, yes, I do. And she said, how do we get from the bottom? And I said, well, you have to spend some money. And she said, well, how much money? And I said, well, I don't know the number, but I will try to figure it out. So I spent a lot of time working out how I would reach the middle of the law school libraries in holdings. And I got down to an estimate, and I called her up and I said we would need $1.5 million to reach that goal. And there was a great big pause, and I said, you can't give me all the money at once. She said, well, why not? And I said, well, you have to spend it all in 1 year. And I said, there's no way I could spend $1.5 million in that short a period of time and do it in any kind of rational fashion.
Yeah.
So I had prepared a report for her, which she forwarded, and finally the vice president of the university said, well, what if we gave you $500,000 and we did it over a 3-year period? And I said, well, it's kind of pushing it. And as it got down, we got them down to a 5-year period and $200,000, which wasn't $1.5 million. So that was how we had planned to get to the middle of the road. Then, of course, Jerry DuPont started the LLMC, and so I could miniaturize a lot of things. And so I got into the miniaturization part of the business.
That's right, microfilms and microfiche had come
Microfilm.
along, and, yeah.
And microfiche, I remember sending the dean a note about microfiche, and she sent back a note saying microfiche, and I said no, fiche, and I had to explain to her what they were.
Yeah.
So we got into a lot of doing a lot of miniaturization, and that was an interesting part of the project. So it was interesting to do. And then, of course, we were working with the other librarians in the Chicago area, and we set up a group so that we would actually lend books to each other, so that then that took off some of the pressure to have everything. When it started, a lot of my assistants would meet someone else's assistant on the L, and they would transfer the books on an L platform.
On the fly,
On
so
the
to speak,
fly, as it was. And then George managed to work out some sort of a deal with the main library at the Northwestern, so that they would get books from there, and they had an automobile to do it, and so we managed to make a project out of that, and so we could put the books in the car and they would get circulated. So that was one of the interesting things that we did as a group, and so that was an interesting project.
Well, you were at the university for Loyola for
25 years,
25 years. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a career almost in itself.
It really was. I had a chance to help build 2 libraries, and to build a collection. We actually got within a stone's throw of the midway point in the book development business. So I felt that was a great accomplishment to be able to do. I had a lot of fun doing it. We had a good staff of people who just worked very hard. We started what I called your personal librarian, and so every one of our staff was assigned to one of the faculty, and so that there wasn't any question about who did you speak to. You had your own personal librarian, and they may not be able to answer your question, but they were the transformer of the material so it worked out very well in that regard. So it was an interesting experience from that way.
Well, it sort of set the era you were in. You and I retired at the same time, so
Same
I
time.
know you retired in 2003. So going back about 25 years takes you back, if I'm doing this correctly, to about 1978. So
Yes.
that's the period. And that's when the microfilms and the microfiche and the beginning of the digital stuff started to all come in during that era.
Well, I remember setting up the first Lexus and Westlaw terminals and going to the dean and saying, we have to find a wizard, a microfilm or a computer wizard, because I said, this guy is no wizard. And so we hired a young man, Mark Giangrande, and Mark, I think, is still on the staff over at DePaul. But Mark helped, and when we had the meeting here in Chicago, we were able to show off our computer lab that had been put together. And of course, now every student has his own little lab tucked under his arm, but that was another one of those.
More power on your telephone now than there was in all the big computers of the earlier era.
Yeah. And so I watched the whole thing.
Yeah.
I remember kidding Dick Spinelli. I said, you know, first you sold me books, then you sold me microfilm, then you sold me microfiche, now you're selling me computer stuff. I said, what are you going to sell me next?
And if he can figure out what to tell you, that is, you really
did.
have a wizard on your hands there too.
So it was a interesting experience.
Now, you taught while you were at the law school. Could you tell
I
a
taught
bit about
legal-
that?
I taught legal research in the first year, and then I taught a course called Advanced Legal Research, and that was sort of self-selected course. We tried to get all the students up to snuff so that they could do basic legal research, and then you found students who really wanted to know something about doing some research, took my advanced course, and I tried to work it with faculty members so that a student would be doing the research for me in preparation of preparing a paper for a faculty member, and that worked pretty well. And it was interesting to see the variety of topics. And of course, you, as a librarian, you know that you have all this material going through your hands, and so I had a dozen students working on projects, and I could supply them with all kinds of information, and they were always amazed that you knew so much about their topic. And I used to tell them I was a garbage man. I collected lots of information, but I wasn't quite sure I knew how to put it all together, but that was their job.
That's interesting. Well, you must have impressed a few people very favorably around that university, because I remember learning upon the occasion of your retirement that Loyola awarded you one of their more prestigious awards, the Francis J. Rooney St. Thomas More Award.
I was really very pleased with that because it was an alumni award, and Rooney had been a law librarian at the beginning, and of course St. Thomas More was the patron saint of law libraries.
Yeah.
So it was something which I was really so pleased to be recognized, especially by the alumni.
I know that we have a group who's going to be using this room in a few minutes, so to sort of move us along, could I also mention you were very active in the Chicago chapter of AALL and served as president of that organization, and also hold their lifetime achievement reward for the Chicago Area Law Library Association.
That was, again, one of those times when you know all the work you've done in your community, is recognized, and it really is such an honor. I was so pleased to receive the Marion Gallagher Award.
Yeah, that was the next one I was going to mention, and you have, and that's AELL's highest award. The
Yes, and
Marion
I-
Gould Gallagher Distinguished Service Award.
And I couldn't talk to myself for a whole day. I was so thrilled with it. I
You were
mean,
too important to talk to yourself, maybe, getting that award. Well, seriously,
I had
a
the
well-deserved
privilege
honor.
of knowing Marion,
Yeah.
so it wasn't like it was some prestigious award that was named after somebody, but it was someone that you knew and respected, and that was certainly one of the things. I thought one of the great praises I got, my dean did a lot of going out and doing the inspections for the American Bar Association, and Roy Mirsky. I bumped into Roy at one of the meetings, and he said, "Your dean knows more about law libraries than any dean I've ever met." And I said to Roy, "It's hard teaching deans how to run law libraries." But,
Or how to let the director run the law library sometimes, too.
well, when I first went to Loyola, the chairman of the library committee didn't want us to put call numbers on the back of books. He thought it was a waste of time. And so I had to go down and explain to him that it was important so that people could put them back in the right place. And he still was kind of insistent. And finally, I said, do you have a library degree that I don't know of? And he said, "No, I don't." And I said, "Well, I think you need to let me do this so that we have some consistency." And many years later, he recalled that meeting and said, "I don't think anyone's ever called me to task and did it so nicely." And I said, "Well,
I hope it worked.
it worked."
Good. Well, you've done a lot professionally, and you want to tell us a little bit about some of that? I know you've talked about working with the other Chicago law libraries, the academics, and I've mentioned your chapter presidency. Are there any things you'd like to sort of highlight?
I think I was a good member of the association. I tried to be helpful. I laughed when I thought about all of the people that were president that I had a chance to serve under. And I always tried to be a good person, and I would say, whatever it is you want me to do, I will do it. So I've served on any number of committees, and I loved going to the AALL meetings. It was a way to recharge my battery, but it also was a time where you could learn something new that you didn't know before, or that you might have thought of but didn't think it would work, and someone would say, "Oh yeah," and so you sat down and had a good conversation with them.
We were in the profession at a very interesting time, in my opinion, because so much was changing and so much was going on, and those meetings were essential
Yes.
to not only learn on the formal programs, but learn who you could ask
Yeah,
between
well,
meetings. And
just the miniaturization.
Yeah.
I learned so much about it, and how it was so integral to the improvement of my collection and so forth. Of course, now it's passé, but at that time it was a very important step. The little things that you learn, that you carry forward. When I would find things couldn't find things in the library when I first started, Jim Coward would keep the little slips, and then he would go and find them in more cases than not, and he would come back and tell you where you missed up. And so it was the kind of thing that made you learn to pay attention
Yeah, I
to detail.
imagine his need to do that would end fairly quickly after a few of those lessons, because you would remember all that stuff.
Yeah, and then you learn to all of the maintaining the library. You know, I remember going out and having to put together all of the shepherds and make sure they were all in proper order, so forth. And at a time, the book salespeople were so important. When they came, they were like the traveling tinkers. You know, they had all kinds of stories to tell you about what was going on in the profession.
Yeah. Well, we didn't have the lists and stuff on the internet in those
No.
days. We didn't have the internet in those days.
And they carried the word. And there were some great people who would go through your, come and visit and go through your collection, and they'd say, you know, you haven't got this, so you haven't got that. You know, and that
Which
was
they just
very
happened
important.
to have available if you wanted to purchase it.
Well, you know, when you think of people like Fred Dennis,
Yeah,
Jim McHugh,
yeah. Bill Hines
Bill
Sr., Phil Cohn.
yeah.
And in more modern times, Dick Spinelli, you already mentioned
Well,
some time ago.
Dick was again one of those
Yeah.
those great people.
And Fred Rothman.
Fred
in
Rothman.
his day.
Paul.
Yeah, Paul Rothman.
I remember attending the miniaturization thing with Paul and Carol Meyer. Do you remember Carol?
No, I remember Carol. Yeah.
Carol was a great friend,
Yeah.
and we went out for dinner, and Carol had rented a car, and Paul was sitting in the front seat, and Carol said, "Do you know how to get back to the dormitory?" I said, "Yeah, but," and the road, we were at we're in California, and it was a busy mountainous area, and I said, "Yeah, I can get back, but did you have the brakes fixed?" So Paul spent most of the ride with his feet against stuck very hard against the
And no
floorboard.
GPSs in the cars
No
to save you when
GPS.
you were lost.
We would have had a great time.
Yeah. Well, Bob, we've spoken about a lot of things, and I know the people that have this room reserved with a little overlap from when you had it reserved, so we can accommodate them. But before we sort of wrap up today, is there anything we've not mentioned that you would like to talk about?
Oh,
Too much?
well, as I said earlier, I think I had a great education at Harvard. I worked with some of the finest librarians in the world, I thought, and they introduced me to the other finest librarians. I think of R Charpentier is one of those people that I met through that. You know, there are just so many great
You've
memories.
dropped a number of names, and boy, they bring back memories for me too, because
Yeah.
we're the same vintage in
Yeah.
this field, but.
But I mean, it was just so many wonderful people who added to your whole career that it's really, sometimes, as I said, that's why I wrote a lot of it down. You know, Tom Reynolds, for example, I thought was a wonderful librarian, and Tom and I not always saw eye to eye, because I think Tom thought I was one of those people who was going to get in his way, but we learned to accommodate each other, and we had a wonderful experience, and that was someone, again, who you learned a lot from. So it was a good experience from from that. And I was just, very fortunate to have needed a job and found one where I could use my skill in my head rather than my shoulders and my legs, which don't work that well. So it was a thing. I always admired Dick Beer, for example, on how hard
Oh, yeah,
he
from
worked.
Michigan. Yeah.
From Michigan. He was a wonderful person. And I had Frank Bay from New England School of Law. Frank came to the law school while I was still a student. And when I finished, he and I became great friends. And, we worked on searching the law with Ed Banda. And so that was a great experience. I remember Ed, we were at the meeting and Ed said, I want you guys to help me finish this thing. I'm sick of it. So Frank and I finished it with him. And then I said, I had this idea for books dealing just strictly with state practice. And they thought it was a good idea. And so I went to the publisher and she said she had to check with whoever she was working with, Heidi. But anyway, she said yes. And so I called Frank and Ed up and said, it's a go. And they said, we don't want to do it. And I said, well, I got this contract, I'm going to finish it. So I did the first edition. I told her it would be done in a year. So I did one state every week.
Wow.
So I spent a lot of hours going through state practice materials.
That was quite a project.
And,
yeah.
You don't sell a lot of books in this field. I got on the elevator at a meeting in Seattle, and a young woman said, are you the person who's written Searching the Law of the States? I said, yes, and she said, I use it almost every day, thank you. And I thought, that's why I did it, and it certainly wasn't for the money.
Well, maybe on that, I want to thank you, Bob Doyle, for participating in our oral history and sharing so much of the things that we all were part of.
Yes, being a law librarian is one of the great experiences of my life and something of which I am very proud.
Yeah.
And that's why I wanted to be part of this project, because I wanted to say thank you. And I thought this was a way to do it.
Thank you.
Thank
Well,
you.
it was a wonderful way to earn a living, in my opinion, and I got to know people like you. And that made it even more wonderful.
Yeah, well, when I was, at one point, my son, who's a lawyer, he said, Dad, why don't you practice law? You can make a lot more money. And I said, Barry, I'm a good librarian. I'm not sure what kind of a lawyer I would make. And I said, the other important thing is that I get up every day and I look forward to doing what I'm doing. I said, you don't want to get up in the morning and say, do I have to go to that place again today? So it was a wonderful experience, and I'm very happy with what I've done.
Well, thank you again for being part of today.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and being so patient with me.